In this episode, Ben Shapiro explores the paradox between the strong economic indicators in the United States and the widespread negative public sentiment about the economy. He delves into inflation, unemployment, stock market trends, and the reasons behind Americans' economic anxieties, especially among young people. Alongside, he discusses recent crime incidents in Charlotte, North Carolina, ongoing challenges related to immigration policies, with a focus on the Somali American community, and critiques political responses to these issues. Despite many positive economic statistics, including a historically low unemployment rate of 4.4%, moderate inflation hovering around 3%, and a booming stock market, with the Dow Jones reaching near 48,000 points, many Americans feel economically insecure. Shapiro notes stock valuations, particularly for companies like Tesla, are inflated due to futuristic bets on AI and robotics rather than current earnings. He explains the complexity of interpreting stock market optimism, supported by rising earnings and potential Federal Reserve interest rate cuts anticipated to stimulate further growth, despite worries about job growth slowing and layoffs in sectors like retail. Shapiro highlights that while inflation has moderated compared to the extreme highs of recent years, the lingering effects still weigh heavily on American households. He points out government stimulus during the pandemic led to rapid inflation, especially in housing prices, where supply constraints and regulations have worsened affordability. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent acknowledges these challenges, attributing some to overregulation and scarcity, particularly in Democratic-controlled urban areas. The episode emphasizes that real wage increases have not kept pace with cost increases, leaving many feeling financial strain even though headline inflation numbers have fallen from their peaks. A significant portion of the discussion centers on why young Americans report economic hardship despite positive macroeconomic data. Citing Harvard polls, Shapiro notes that over 40% of ages 18 to 29 feel they are struggling financially or only getting by, with many fearing they will be worse off than their parents. This demographic exhibits declining support for capitalism and socialism alike, suggesting disillusionment with traditional economic frameworks. He stresses the role of expectations, residency in high-cost metropolitan areas, and limited residential mobility as factors impacting affordability and wage stagnation. The episode stresses the importance of understanding these demographic nuances and dispelling myths about college employment and youth unemployment, noting that graduates in STEM and medical fields still enjoy low unemployment rates. The podcast dissects how economic realities differ widely by location, from expensive metro hubs like New York and Los Angeles to more affordable smaller cities and rural areas. Shapiro explains that demographic shifts, with more Americans clustering in large metros, drive demand and thus prices upward, combined with local resistance to new housing developments, which exacerbates scarcity. The decline in residential mobility since the 1980s means fewer people leave expensive cities, further tightening housing markets. He advocates for policy changes, including deregulation and incentivizing relocation to more affordable regions as measures to improve accessibility and economic opportunity. Shapiro discusses the efforts within former President Trump's team to pivot messaging to emphasize affordability and the real economic concerns of Americans, rather than relying solely on macroeconomic statistics. Despite pressure, Trump has often declined to engage directly with the economic anxieties people feel, focusing instead on blaming prior administrations for inflation. The podcast touches on political strategies surrounding inflation, trade, tariffs, and food prices, as well as the challenge of addressing complex systemic issues like housing affordability without oversimplifying. The episode covers a troubling crime involving a Honduran illegal immigrant with a criminal record who repeatedly re-entered the U.S. and allegedly stabbed a man in Charlotte. This incident is framed within the broader context of immigration enforcement failures and resurging concerns about border security. Shapiro notes the politically charged nature of this issue, especially in swing states like North Carolina, where upcoming Senate races are closely watched. Shapiro paints a grim picture of urban centers such as Los Angeles MacArthur Park and New York City, detailing spikes in drug use, homelessness, and public safety concerns exacerbated by local government policies favoring minimal intervention and opposition to homeless camp sweeps. He criticizes Democratic leadership for these deteriorating conditions and links them to broader governance and public policy failures. The episode addresses an ongoing scandal involving extensive welfare fraud within the Somali American community in Minnesota, tying it to criticisms of the Biden administration's immigration policies. Shapiro discusses controversies around interior enforcement, racial profiling allegations, and political pushback from local and national officials, including Representative Ilhan Omar and Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison. The segment underscores tensions between law enforcement efforts and accusations of systemic bias, as well as implications for Medicaid funding and public service integrity. Shapiro highlights internal frustrations within the Trump administration regarding leadership at the Department of Homeland Security, particularly the role of Secretary Kristi Noem and her association with advisor Corey Lewandowski. Speculation about possible personnel changes also surfaces, alongside defense of Secretary of War Pete Hegseth amid media criticism over military operations against narcotics traffickers, which have been contested by some political figures on legal and moral grounds. The podcast critiques President Trump's controversial use of presidential pardons, including those granted to a former Honduran president convicted of drug trafficking and to Congressman Henry Cuellar, who subsequently announced a run as a Democrat. Shapiro suggests this misuse complicates political messaging and hampers Republican efforts to defend these decisions amid public scrutiny. Brief attention is given to Trump securing the World Cup for the United States and receiving a trophy from FIFA with a humorous appraisal of the award's unattractiveness. Trump's remarks about renaming American football are criticized as an unnecessary cultural concession, illustrating the interplay between politics and cultural identity. Looking ahead, the episode previews a forthcoming Supreme Court decision related to the constitutionality of executive branch officials' removal as contested during the Trump administration. This legal battle is framed as significant for the future of executive authority and the limits on presidential power moving forward.